On Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to a sweeping climate change declaration issued by the world's leading Islamic scholars, calling on the world's 1.6 billion Muslims to do their part to eliminate dangerous greenhouse gas emissions and turn towards renewable energy sources. The declaration urges world leaders meeting in Paris later this year to commit to a 100% zero-emission strategy and to invest in decentralized renewable energy in order to reduce poverty and the catastrophic impacts of climate change. The declaration comes on the heels of the publication of Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment earlier this year, which also calls for sweeping action on climate change. Like the encyclical, this declaration, endorsed by more than 60 leading Islamic scholars, links climate change to the economic system, stating, quote, "We recognize the corruption that humans have caused on the earth due to our relentless pursuit of economic growth and consumption." It places special emphasis on richer countries and communities, noting that the risks of climate change are, quote, "unevenly distributed and are generally greater for the poor and disadvantaged communities of every country at all levels of development."
To talk more about the significance of this declaration, we go to London to speak with Salim ul-Haq, one of the contributors and signatories to the Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change, a climate scientist at the International Institute for Environment and Development in London, and director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. Salim ul-Haq, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about what prompted the declaration, who wrote it, and who are the major signatories on it.
I think the origin of this came some few months ago when the Climate Action Network, a group of climate activists, got together with the Islamic Relief Worldwide, a humanitarian Islamic organization that does quite a lot of work with vulnerable communities around the world. And they agreed that this was something that they should take up, and got in touch with Islamic scholars and leading clergy around the world and started drafting a potential declaration of this kind. And then they held a two-day symposium in Istanbul, which ended just a day or so ago, where they brought about 60 international scholars, Muslim scholars, leading clergy from different countries, and invited me as a climate scientist to join them, also a Muslim as well. And we honed the final declaration, which came out and has been released. And it's aimed very much at the 1.6 billion Muslims around the world, bringing to their attention the verses of the Holy Quran, which enjoin Muslims everywhere to preserve the environment as stewards of the environment, and at the same time not cause harm to other people by their own pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And so at a personal level, to reduce our emissions, and at a global level, to join efforts by all faiths and all countries to bring down the fossil fuel use to zero as soon as possible.
Well, last month, Democratic presidential candidate Martin O'Malley made headlines by suggesting that the rise of the so-called Islamic State came about in part because of the effects of climate change. He was speaking on Bloomberg TV.
One of the things that preceded the failure of the nation-state of Syria and the rise of ISIS was the effect of climate change and the mega drought that affected that region, wiped out farmers, drove people to cities, created a humanitarian crisis. It created the symptoms, or rather the conditions of extreme poverty that has led now to the rise of ISIL and this extreme violence.
Dr. Salim ul-Haq, your response, I mean, to what extent do you think the conflicts in Syria, Iraq, etc., Yemen, are exacerbated by climate change? Can the creation of ISIS really be attributed to the effects of a changing climate?
I don't think there's a direct attribution of the rise of ISIS as an organization to climate change, but there is no denying the underlying logic of the statement that we just heard, which is that there was a continuing drought for quite a few years in Syria that predates the conflict, the civil war, and the rise of ISIS, and caused migration and refugees going from the rural areas to urban areas. And that's the kind of thing that climate change is likely to cause in future, and almost certainly will cause future conflicts.
And Dr. Haq, what does the declaration call on some of the Muslim-majority oil-producing countries to do? They're the ones with among the least incentives to cut down on fossil fuels, since they're dependent on them for their economy.
Well, first of all, it enjoins all the Muslims in those countries as individuals to do what they can to reduce their own carbon footprints, and also to help their fellow Muslims who very often are amongst the most vulnerable people to the impacts of climate change. People like Muslims living in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, my country, and in parts of Africa. Many of these are Muslims who are suffering the consequences. And therefore, those of us who are better off have a duty to help them, protect them, and to stop causing the pollution that is causing the impacts on them. And at the same time, hope to influence the leaders of these countries that it's in their own best interest to move away from fossil fuels in the long run. And indeed, this is beginning to happen. If you look at the leaders of Abu Dhabi, for example, they are investing heavily in solar energy and in renewable energy because they know that their oil is not going to last forever.
Salim al-Haq, we want to thank you for being with us, one of the contributors and signatories to the Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change, climate scientist at the International Institute for Environment and Development in London, director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we're going to be talking about a prisoner who was killed by a beat-up squad in prison. Who were these guards? And also, what happened to the prisoners at Dannemora once two prisoners escaped? Now, prison authorities have been arrested and let go at Dannemora, but prisoners were beaten up. We'll get the latest. Stay with us.